I was intentionally going over 11 because I know some people were checking out, but it looks like most everybody's back, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So Sean suggested, I think it's a great idea that we go around the table and have let's unintroduce yourself, negate yourself completely. That we each take an opportunity either to reflect on the conference or what we want to see if we were ever to do this again. I would love to hear that. If anything shifted for you. However, I'm giving you each 5 minutes. Oh. Is that too much even? Yeah. You think it's too much? Yeah. I think it's going to take 5 minutes. On the outside, you're allowed to take 1 minute. Right. But at 5 minutes, I really need a heavier object. I'm going to start using my computer. Oh, genius. Okay, I'll start tapping the glass. Okay, so do you want to just start with Massimo and go around? I got you started. Click.
All right. I just tweeted it. I'm about to start now. First of all, this was a great experience, and thanks to Sean for bringing about, and to you for bringing it about as well. I was a little skeptical, honestly, when the first time that sort of you approached me and said, first of all, you're not going to convince this many people to come into the same place in the same time. You did. And second of all, I'm sure there's going to be interesting fist fights, but nothing more than that. Turns out I hadn't seen much in the way of fist fights. I'm not sure that people necessarily have changed their mind. I know I have not significantly moved from my initial positions, but on the other hand, I wasn't expecting that. I think that's unreasonable. I mean, most thoughtful people change their mind after a while that they cogitate on things. This is one more experience that puts input into my brain, both conscious and unconscious. And eventually, I'll keep thinking about it. You keep being exposed to different views of different ways of presenting the same views by different people, and sometimes you do change your mind about things. I certainly have learned a lot about people's positions. I have identified 2 or 3 areas where I think actually I'm stronger in my position than I was before, and I have identified 1 or 2 areas where I need to be concerned and think about it. And the other thing I think that we shouldn't really underestimate, even though it does sound sort of touchy-feely, it was nice to actually see people in person and have a beer with Jerry last night and just chat with Alex at the same table and that sort of stuff, just to mention 2 of my usual antagonists, I guess it's one way to put it. Because that way, you put a human face on things, and the next time you attack the ideas, but you're more careful about attacking the person, which I think is something that I personally strive for, but sometimes I fail. So in terms of the sort of general ideas, it seems to me clear that I need to read more in the philosophy of physics. The primary physical literature in physics, particularly in quantum mechanics, it's a little bit difficult. So I might actually ask people for suggestions for second level sources. But I find that area actually very interesting as far as, of course, it's relevant to almost everything we've discussed today. Because it goes at the roots of what does it mean to be a naturalist, to be a determinist, and to be a reductionist. And those are clearly philosophical questions that are informed not much by biology as much as by fundamental physics. So that's what I need to concentrate more efforts. At the same time, I think that I've been made to think about things like the free will debate. I think I'm now convinced that we really need to stay away from that term. I mean, I've actually, this is in agreement with Jerry. Yes, it was a partial shift. I mean, I've actually thought about that before, but this time it definitely put me over the edge and saying, we really should try to avoid that thing, because it's just not helpful. Not the topic, obviously, the term, because it's really not helpful. And I guess, however, in terms of sort of substance, I confirm myself closer to, I guess, Dan's position, or some variation thereof, in terms of what I actually think about that. I still, yes, that's okay. I don't have a lot else to say at the moment. The other thing that I'm concerned about is this whole thing about emergence. I think that we have not explored enough non-mystical, non-Mysterian, interesting ways in which you can talk about emergence, which I think are there, out there. There's at least a couple of different ways. For instance, the word supervenience has never come up, which is kind of interesting. Supervenience. Is what? Actually, I think there is such a thing. I also don't think it's particularly useful in discussing emergence, because it actually deals with a very weak version of emergence. But it should have come up, at least, even just as to dismiss it. I think there are interesting areas there in the philosophy of physics where we could go back and revisit that topic. And yes, I would come back to something like this, perhaps more focused on a subset of topics, obviously.
I was skeptical about this whole conference, to be honest. I did not like the general idea. Basically, anything Sean wants to do turns out to be interesting, and I'm interested, but this one was, to me, way too philosophical in its concept, I thought. And I was ready to be surprised if anything would really come out of it other than a lot of very general talk. Where I'm ending up is still with my reverence to science, but feeling that there are topics which I was concerned about with science because we weren't getting answers, and I've come to the conclusion that there is a point where philosophy is basically subducting under science, where it's convenient to throw those topics to philosophy, whether it's many worlds or anthropic or what, which, at least on a temporary basis, philosophy can look at, work at, and maybe ultimately throw useful ideas back to science, which will help turn those back into scientific principles, and vice versa. So this is cool. I'm getting more reverence for philosophy than I had before, although I don't want to spend a lot of time reading it, except for Dan's books, which I do read. But I will say, and I mentioned this to Sean, this has fundamentally changed my life, as it turns out. Because one of the subjects that I was very interested in, because it feeds into my background and what I've been working on, which is the criminal justice system. And it has really changed my mind, because even though I think it's possible I might be among the most hardcore naturalists here, and I don't know if there's free will, and I don't know if there's consciousness, and to me it's basically prove it to me. Nonetheless, it's clear that we got to work with these concepts in society and act as if they exist, otherwise it's going to be very complicated for society. I don't think we should be patronizing and hold back our reverence for naturalism. At the same time, I think we can work with concepts of volition, and we need to, in terms of our justice system and the way society works. I think we need to radically overhaul the criminal justice system, and I've been thinking that. I am even more determined than ever to work on that. I'm not sure there's a big difference between how we should treat people who are criminally insane and people who are criminally guilty, because I think that there are concerns about free will and about volition. And I've already been thinking that, but it is really confirming my dedication to do that. I think that we've got a medieval justice system that needs to take into account modern neuroscience and other concepts we talked about here. So thank you all for helping me come around to that. And my other thought, which I mentioned in the beginning, that I could change my mind about the value of bringing a lot of smart people together and a lot of cool things come from that, haven't changed my mind. It really can happen. So it's been really great meeting all of you, and a pleasure to have been able to facilitate it. And thank you for your patience with my naivete. Simon?
So I had three things I thought I would just bring up, and they're short, I promise. So I had, obviously, being in the same room with intellectual heroes is great. I feel like I'm 12 because I first read many people here when I was 12.
I thought you were 12.
That's right. You're always the youngest person in the room. We're the oldest, so that's true. The thing I learned a huge amount about was reductionism explanation, intertheoretic relationships. The first day was just huge for me. I understood Sean much better. This notion of entailment, these are some really provocative concepts that I'm going to take back and wrestle with, and thank you for indulging me when I tried to put something up on the board. I'm really grateful. One thing I was surprised we didn't get into as much was functionalism. So, evolution is a huge pillar of modern science, and I think functionalism is too. I've been told I should explain better, so I was talking to David Poeppel last night about his work, and his work is about the computational states of the brain, at least as I interpret it. The way that we talk about, the way David talks about it, seems to be, in some ways, the domain of computer science, particularly theoretical computer science, and which is how I think about social systems. And yet, there seem to be a huge number of problems that emerge there that are both conceptually interesting and also perhaps provocative for notions of responsibility, moral responsibility. And so let me just bring up one, right? So we like to attach moral value to the conscious part of ourselves. If I'm sleepwalking and I kill somebody, maybe I shouldn't be held responsible for it, even if the best rational engagements of my brain are making me do it. And there's something we slid past a little bit here, which was, what if the conscious part of our brain is not the most rational part? Should that part we don't feel be given value? Related to that are, we think better in groups. So should conversations be citizens? Should they have rights? If Dan and Rebecca are having a great conversation and their mental states are interacting with each other and producing a larger scale computation, first of all, does it feel anything? Second of all, should we confine them so that this conversation doesn't stop? Or maybe conversations like to die. They're like banthas, or the meal at the end of the universe. That the restaurant at the end of the universe, the one who wants to be eaten. Right? So, and I think the third thing, and I hope I'm not, how much time do I have?
Dad. Sorry.
No,
Sorry. 2 minutes.
2 minutes, great. So very quickly. So biology and neuroscience, to me, seem like very mature subjects, actually. And it's one of the reasons perhaps I don't work in them, because it seems like many of the research programs are very clear. And many of the things you want to do, it's like, let's get some dishes and do the right things. And I've been disabused of that by the exchanges in this corner of the room here. But one thing I would love to see more discussion of is some of the questions that come up in economics or social sciences, and so Dom brought some of these up. So I've always had this feeling that game theory was secretly about rationality. Okay, good. Okay, so people say the rational thing to do is defect, and that's why Nash equilibrium or these kinds of things. And I'm like, what's going on there? And I would love to see a little more excavation as to what economics and the social sciences say about thinking, what it means to think, what the nature of rationality is. And I think you brought this up a little bit, and I missed it. Just parenthetically, and it'd be lovely to excavate that more if we came back. It's just to go to the sciences that are really fuzzy and dirty, and where sort of the questions maybe are simpler and more obvious to play with. So anyway, I'm of course very grateful, and you've been very kind to answer my questions. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
My shot. Okay. I've been quiet during this morning, in part just to sort of catch what's going on. I have never considered myself clearly in any field, and that, I think, is both a problem and an advantage. It's also the bad story about, maybe you're just a dilettante as a result. And so, I've done my best to do good work in each of these areas and look deeply into it, but always in that, and the problem is the interesting questions are always between fields. And you can never do enough. You can never get it all. And I think that's one of the real challenges we experience. And having a group of diverse people talk about things actually helps you figure this out. I mean, I'd never heard of this guy you just mentioned. And yet I've taught most of my career levels of selection stories. Spent, having studied with Lewontin, with Gould, with Wilson, and even Hamilton for a year. I had all this stuff in my head. It was all going on, and we've been arguing about it all along. And yet to find out that there's somebody that somebody at least thinks is terrific that I didn't know about is a real surprise to me. So I think that's one of the real advantages of this. I should say that, as I mentioned before, I sort of have wandered back and forth between these fields, never being in any one real field. And I've mostly just followed questions all of my career. And the questions lead you elsewhere. They lead you out of your field oftentimes. And it's easy to get in trouble when you do that. And yet I think it's the most exciting and the most, for me, I feel like it's almost a noble quest to sort of put yourself out there and get kicked around a little bit, because you'll learn in the end. You figure out where you're wrong and you can make new turns. I think that's great. I also mentioned that, one of the people that really influenced me very, very indirectly was a physicist. Although I started in physics, I didn't want to go there, but Erwin Schrödinger's book, What is Life, I think really changed the field of biology across a discipline, even though he was not talking about things that were really in that discipline. And I think, those of us in evolutionary biology actually haven't learned some of the lessons that he talked about there, or at least the hints he provided. And one of the things I was hoping to get out of this conference, interestingly enough, was especially a debate with Dan and with Richard about evolution, because I've come to change my thinking about evolution, and of course with Jerry, because of the Schrödinger argument about the problem of entropy production. And it's really changed my thinking about biology, and it's changed my thinking about the way evolutionary biology works. And I think one of the interesting things about evolution, Dan made the point that Darwin has contributed a lot in many ways to the philosophical world, but in many ways, this is a really serious question about what kind of causality is it? How do we think about that nature of causality, and how do we link it with other kinds of physical causality? And I think it's very close to one of the reasons that I've sort of shifted recent discussions towards very, very simple questions about the origins of life, is because I think we still don't have a clue what we're talking about. And interestingly enough, I think it's relevant to questions about mind and how the brain works. And the fact is that I don't think we're going to get at those questions until we become we're willing to follow the interdisciplinary route. Work between not just the sciences, but between the science and philosophy as well. And even though there's a lot of disconnect, and I still feel there's a lot of disconnect, and we certainly found it here. I'm going to just make a little side comment about the criminal justice system, which I love your comments about this. My wife worked for 10 years running what's called the prison for special offenders. These are people who are mentally ill and who were deemed so dangerous they couldn't be put in a hospital. Really, really extreme personalities. Just trying to get into their minds, trying to figure out what goes on is such a mind-opening experience. It's almost psychedelic, you might say, that they're so different, their minds are so different. Really, I think this is also part of the neurosciences, that we don't really have a sense of how big that difference is. And there's this whole thing called personality disorders. We don't really have good neuroscience for it. We're sort of getting at it, but it's because we don't really have a very good general theory about how brains work. And one of my problems is that every time I begin to study one of these questions, I say, okay, and this is what David does too, is, what can I do physically to answer the question? So interested early on about human beings and language, I realized that doing the language stuff was going to be really hard. But maybe I could look at brains. What's different about a human brain and a chimpanzee brain and a monkey brain? Maybe that would tell me something about it. Leads me to other questions. Is that my time already? Oh, ouch. Okay, well, let me just end with one piece. And that is that this has been great. I can't say that my mind has been changed, but I'm worried about how general naturalism is. And my view of the problem is that naturalism was implicitly a negative statement, what we're not. These other guys. And we quickly said we're not going to talk about those other guys, but that makes naturalism almost negatively defined, and I was worried about that as a starting point. And this is why I think Massimo says maybe we should be talking about more specific things, or conferences that sort of focus in on specific things might have actually been a little more helpful. So but it's a good start.
With the time, we've done the time, and we're going to have crisscross time too at the end, so that'll be good to respond to Terry.
I pass.
No, you are not allowed to pass. Okay, look at,
Just gauging.
You just spent 10 seconds on that joke.
Just taking the pitch. So, I came to this meeting thinking that I was a beleaguered minority, representing mad dog physicalism, and I'm very relieved to discover that so far from being a mad dog, so far from being a beleaguered minority, my differences with others, especially people whose views I have long respected, are matters of emphasis and shading. That's very reassuring to me. it's also extremely important and valuable for a group like this to get together in the complete absence of non-naturalists so that we can let our hair down and express what we really believe without worrying about its ramifications for broader debates. That's why I regret that this is videotaped and being put on YouTube. There's only one issue that I regret we did not discuss at greater length so that I could get a clearer handle on it. We've had a persistent disagreement around the table about emergence, and some of us insist that there is emergence, and it is not a problem for naturalism. And of course, adjudicating this claim requires us to pin down a concept of emergence, and I don't think it's going to require us to pin down a concept of naturalism, because I think there we are all pretty much in the same region of conceptual space. And of course, it's too late to do that now, but that is the one regret that I have about our agenda.
Thank you, Alex.
So I'll just say 5, I think, very brief things, each under a minute.
And I cede my time to the right honorable gentleman from North Carolina.
Father Flangan. Yeah.
He's not getting the extra couple minutes.
I won't take them. So sort of five things connected. So first, I remain, this makes me feel positive and optimistic about the positive program of naturalism. I'm very confident about its legs to carry on among intellectuals. And as a positive program, and what do I mean by the positive program? I mean at least as committed to more than just the denial of supernaturalism in the realm of knowledge, growth, and production, but actually as a program that basically is comfortable with the idea that what there is and all there is natural. And in some ways, maybe not in a self-centered way, but the idea that maybe we're smart enough to keep figuring out the secrets of nature. Second thing, though, I'm still nervous. I'm as nervous as I was before I came in about the prospects for naturalism in the wider culture. I just think that it's nice to be in a place like this among like-minded people, but I still think that whether or not the wider culture will come around is a completely open question, and I get nervous about it. But number 3, I think a key that came out at this conference to whether or not the prospects for naturalism are on the positive side or negative side depends upon whether we can find secular communities for secular meaning. You know, mosques of mattering, something like that, to be ecumenical.
Oh, that's going to go down well.
So that we're not bowling alone. I mean, and I think what came out nicely is that we take this problem, seriously, some more than others. The fourth thing is, and this relates to something Alex said, and maybe I'm accentuating the positive. This is my nature, the half-full aspect. I was happy, but maybe it was under-discussed. I was happy that the kind of naturalism that I thought was discussed here was not reductive and was not eliminativist and was happy with naturalistic emergence. I guess I would put it that way, coming in. We're comfortable with talking about levels and emergent phenomenon. But I think that Alex's way of putting it, it was under-discussed. So I'm not positive,
You were less happy than we both.
Yeah, and finally, this goes back to something Massimo said. My view was strongly confirmed that although almost everything I think Dan says about if you were going to give a positive view of free will, this is what it should look like. It should be a compatibilist conception. I think that what Jerry and then the discussion that he helped us have shows that the concept of free will is so contested, so embedded in several different traditions, that it would be better if we just said we're not going to talk about that anymore. I mean, I took this position in writing in 2000 in The Problem of the Soul. I just said it is a philosophical black hole and it sucks in all smart people and then we don't come out and there's no light shed. So I do think that switching up the conversation and saying that has too many connotations, there's these contested meanings, we'll go back to what Aristotle said. Let's talk about voluntary and involuntary. Let's talk about when John Dewey says, I gave this quote to Dan, I think many, many years ago from Dewey. He says, what men and women have fought for in the name of freedom has never been metaphysical freedom of the will. It's always been political freedom, social freedom, and so on. And then secondly, I think, on the free will topic, the devil's in the details, and I very much agree with what Terry said following up on the comment about criminal justice, which is so helpful. You know, we're going to figure this out. We can't be, this is part of the naturalistic program. I mean, we're here now. It's a long, long program. It'll take for as long as we're around. We'll figure out the different causes of human behavior, and then we're going to have to make wise judgments about which causes we think are exculpatory and which ones are not. And we are going to have to take into account what Simon said too, is we may overrate the and ascribe moral worth or lack of worth to events too much based on the conscious proximate causes. And it just may be that as we understand the whole system better, we'll have a better view about human action, and that will change, I think, our conception about morality in the law. But that's a long way down the road. I have nothing enlightening to say except wait and see. Thank you.
Wow, 4 seconds left. Excellent. Perfect. Beautifully timed.
I cede my 4 seconds.
No, you don't. Sorry. And for that, I'm docking him 4 seconds.
So thanks everyone for this most interesting few days. I enjoyed it a great deal. No, I don't think my mind has been changed, but a few important things I think were reinforced and clarified to some extent. So, I found yesterday afternoon's discussion, though painful though I realize it must have been for non-philosophers, I did find it quite helpful in getting clearer as to what's at stake in some issues. I've thought for a very long time that the only challenge to naturalism I truly think should be taken truly seriously is a kind of eliminativist challenge, roughly the kind that Alex defends. That is, so James in my book is subtitled Metaphysics Naturalized, or Naturalizing Metaphysics, I forget which. Metaphysics Naturalized. Right, well, of course, the alternative is the only alternative we really take seriously to naturalizing metaphysics is abolishing metaphysics. Right, it's self-evident to me that non-naturalized metaphysics is nonsense. So, and I think if we were persuaded by Alex, that is the road to that's abolition of metaphysics. Now, I've always thought as well, and this was reinforced yesterday, that issue ultimately comes down to the question of whether we can successfully ground notions of representation, because once you get representation, we can get all the rest of the stuff that's really at issue. Can we ground notions of representation seriously, not just in a metaphorical fashion, but actually technically ground it in information and resistance to entropy? So I happily came out of yesterday's conversation thinking, right, there's a kind of general agreement that's the project that has to be carried out, and ultimately, I think that's what determines whether we shall have naturalized metaphysics or no metaphysics. I'm going to join the general consensus that we've heard around the table, and I was also persuaded that, free will just looks like it's got as a phrase, looks like it has too many barnacles on it. And this, of course, happens sometimes to phrases. I mean, rationality is another one like that. In the first chapter of the book I'm currently finishing up on economics, I say, on philosophy of economics, I say, rationality has typically, insofar as it's ever meant anything, rationality has meant what God would think. Right? Since there's no God, I'm not going to talk about rationality again in this book. Right? I mean, I think it once was a really good word, but it's been ruined. Right? So it's time to retire it. I'm inclined to think that about free will, and my sympathies on the substantive issues are entirely with Dan's view. I'm a compatibilist in that sense, but I think we will probably never succeed in persuading people to understand that compatibilist position if we insist on using the phrase free will. So, okay, let's retire it. I would have enjoyed a little more, if in terms of things that I would have liked to have seen us talk a little bit more about, I would have enjoyed more discussion about interpretations of quantum mechanics. It would have been nice if that was actually a topic. It came up parenthetically now and again, but we really didn't have a go at it. James and I have recently written a paper which is coming out in the book we're editing from Oxford UP next month, in which we defend the original Copenhagen interpretation, not the later Copenhagen interpretation, right? Not the Copenhagen. So,
all right,
right. The Copenhagen interpretation.
Now you tell me.
The Copenhagen interpretation that, according to philosophers, isn't an interpretation.
Yeah.
Right. In that one.
Yeah. Okay.
Original board. Original board. So we could have had an interesting go about that.
Yeah, we'll have lunch. Okay.
Yeah. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks,
Okay.
Thanks everybody for so many interesting remarks that everyone made.
All right, so yeah, for me also, the movement of the workshop was not in the direction of changing my mind about things, but certainly in the direction of sharpening ideas I had about things, very much in a very important way. One of the pre-existing ideas I had coming in was that it's always fun to bring smart and interesting people into the same room, and good things happen that you don't predict, and that was absolutely verified. So thanks everyone for participating in that. I guess the major idea about naturalism, and sort of the idea I have about naturalism moving forward, naturalism itself, rather than all the disciplinary interests, is the idea that there is one world, the natural world, but there are many ways of talking about that natural world. And it's understanding the many ways of talking about it and how they fit together and are verified and are useful or rejected that is the important part of the program. So I can't resist mentioning one of the papers that was foundational for my understanding of thinking about layers and emergence and things like that. It was by Sidney Coleman, who taught Janna and me quantum field theory many years ago. In 1975, he wrote a paper called Quantum Sine-Gordon Equation as the Massive Turing Model. Anyone else have this as their favorite paper? No? It's about, he finds a model theory in one dimension of space, one dimension of time, and it's actually two theories. There's a theory called the quantum sine-Gordon equation, which is just a terrible, terrible term that he used as a joke and then caught on. We have a boson, since we're going back to bosons and fermions. There's a boson and a particular potential, and the potential is just a sine wave. It goes up and down. And there's a whole nother theory, which is a theory of fermions, also in one spatial dimension, where these fermions can bump into each other and interact. And what Coleman shows and the utterly independently written theories, one theory of bosons, one theory of fermions. And Coleman proves mathematically that they're secretly the same exact theory. That in this boson theory, you not only have little oscillations in the potential, which look like bosons, but you also have big variations, which go from one minimum to another, and they act like fermions. And you crank up the coupling constant, and you show that everything that you can calculate in one theory is exactly the same as you would get from doing it in the other theory. So here is one reality with two very, very different ontologies that are equivalent in every possible way. So that liberated my thinking about the right way to think about reality, in that it made me think that different ways of talking about the same underlying reality are just as good. And I would say that's even true if they're not equivalent, if, like thermodynamics, is a subset of the domain of applicability of the atomic theory that underlies it. But nevertheless, my own personal view would be that the concepts of thermodynamics are equally real and equally part of how to talk about things. And so I would say the same thing about whatever it is we call volition or free will. I'm kind of getting sympathetic to the idea that free will has too many barnacles. I think that's an interesting idea. But nevertheless, so even if you buy all that, of the ways that we have of talking about the natural world, there are two different species. There are the sort of descriptive vocabularies and there are the normative vocabularies. And I think they're both important, but I think that the ways that we have of talking about them and validating them are very different. And that's something we didn't quite get into talking about at a very specific level. But I think that both the parallelism is important and the differences are important. I think that when we decide what is moral, what is right, or what is aesthetically beautiful, or what is artistic. These are all vocabularies for talking about the world, but in those normative spheres, we don't have recourse to the simple and consensus scientific apparatus that we have for the descriptive ones. So we have contention, and I think that actually I was surprised that there seemed to be so much potential common ground when we were talking about morality, that we all have impulses in us, and we're all going to have to use some communicative process to work out how to develop that into a theory of morality. So one conclusion of the workshop for me is that I'm even more optimistic about naturalism than I was before, and I would even say that not only academically but also publicly. I think that, you know, I see a way forward to making this a compelling story to tell people. I don't think that we have the vocabulary and the rhetoric to do it yet. I don't think we have the social aspects that we all agree are important, but I see no obstacles in the way to do that. And, you know, 100 years from now, when that's when everyone is a naturalist, they will look back and go, yes, there was that moment in Stockbridge when it all got off the ground.
Stockbridge interpretation.
Exactly, and I'm done.
Perfect.
I want to thank everybody for all you've taught me, and what I've learned in particular is how difficult some of these issues are, and how, in spite of having a bunch of really smart and well-intentioned people around the room, there's still tremendous possibilities for miscommunication, where you can, these hidden pitfalls where you can fall in a hole and you don't realize till you're halfway through the talk and you realize somebody's jumping up and down and what's that about? And then so you learn something else. Echoing what Sean just said, or not echoing it, but recasting it, I think Sean was acknowledging the distinction between the manifest and the scientific image and the difficult task of putting them into registration. And what we've heard is that there are several terms that don't go nicely at all. One of them is design. We had an interesting debate of that. One of them is free will itself. One of them is emergence. Another one is rationality. Well, there's 4 biggies right there. And I'm going to add a 5th one, which is imaginary, because it's an old thought experiment of mine, which I think clarifies this. We go to some distant archipelago and we find people that speak English except for one thing, where we talk about being tired, bushed, exhausted. They talk about all the fatigues they have. Oh, I got so many fatigues in my body now, and more fatigues in my legs and in my arms. And that's their conceptual scheme. That's the way they talk. And we show up and they say, all right, Mr. Scientist, Mrs. Scientist, tell us what fatigues are. Now, what do we do? Do we say, there aren't any fatigues? And they say, there aren't any fatigues. Run around the block, you'll know fatigues. I can feel them. So that's not a very profitable pursuit. If we say, well, I'll tell you what fatigues are, and then we take on the bizarre task of trying to come up with an identification of fatigues with,
necessary and sufficient conditions.
Necessary and sufficient conditions, and we've got a lot of things about blood sugar and lactic acid and so on. No, that's not. No, what we want to do is say, look, turns out your term doesn't carve nature at the joints, really. We'll teach you this other stuff instead, and we'll just sort of show you how you can go back and forth between them, and we aren't going to define fatigues, and we're not going to eliminate fatigues. You want to go talk about fatigues the way we talk about sunsets? Fine. Now, I think that the moral of that story applies for all of these terms. So, what do I think? Let's take the one that matters to me the most here. First of all, I would say emergence for me, I just as soon get rid of the term because I think that there's so much baloney that's been said about emergence. It's got more than barnacles on it. I don't mind barnacles all that much. There's other stuff I don't want my terms covered with. Free will is in a very delicate position because if you just banish it, you create a vacuum, a social vacuum, which is really scary. You got all these people out there saying, science shows we don't have free will, and therefore nobody is ever responsible, and therefore Well, nobody is thinking through the implications of that. If you doubt that, well, one person has thought through the implications, and that's Bruce Waller in the book that I sent you all a review of. And you read that and you think whether you really like the direction that that's going in. So when I said that these issues are political, part of the political problem, I think, is that we do have to talk to the non-scientific, non-naturalistic world about these things. And terms that we can agree on how best to use may nevertheless backfire in our faces very badly. And I just want to say one more thing about that sort of political issue. I have come to the view, actually just this morning, that before this goes out on the web, it really should be test flown very cautiously and carefully with some non-naturalist audiences. Don't send it to them, because then it's out. But somehow get them to sit down and see the edited version, because I look back on these few days and I think we are letting ourselves open for incredible misuse of our words, and that the candor that we have indulged in this weekend could come back to haunt us as various people deliberately misinterpret what we say, and that we could really regret that.
Thanks, Dan. So,
Absolutely, they will.
And by
philosophers-
non-naturalist, what sort of non-naturalist do you mean?
No, I mean creationist, religious types,
We can-
that it would be possible. It would be,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
Yeah, there's also that, yeah, I mean, we have also,
Biologists.
them go for it.
we've also badmouthed a whole lot of people, not very often naming them, but
Right.
still.
Okay. So
But I think that we really should take very seriously that we cannot count on the goodwill of the people that are going to have this. And they will,
We can count on their ill will.
we can count on their ill will, and this is the one problem.
Okay, Dan, so I think this will definitely come up in the crosstalk, and, of course, philosophers are famously more cautious about their language than physicists. We're just sort of like, take it or leave it, man. But it's a good point. And then we want to go to David.
Fascinating weekend. It was very helpful for me for therapeutic reasons, actually, because I had a very difficult couple of weeks. And being here and listening to this it took my mind off of other very serious matters in my life, which I appreciate. It was entertaining. I changed my mind about two things. I changed my mind about free will and morality. And
Those are big.
those are big ones. Because I'm so naive, I thought that scientists could actually tackle at least part of it, because we don't think of those as undecomposed wholes. All our discussion was about free will and morality as if those were monolithic concepts. But when we try those out in a kind of, as scientists, we break an act of free will or a moral judgment down into its constituent parts. And my presupposition has always been those you can study. So that's different. That we had this discussion briefly yesterday. It's different than talking about a normative standard of morality, or the actual act of making a moral judgment. That I don't see why you can't study that. I think you can. That being said, I changed my mind about that. I think we shouldn't, because I think that even if we're very pedantic and careful about decomposing these concepts into their constituent parts, we're not ready. And it looks like we're going to need philosophy to do a better job parsing these into parts that we can actually investigate. So I changed my mind about both of those. I thought I wasn't sympathetic to any of the, for instance, neurobiological analyses of these. I think they're shitty, and but that doesn't mean people aren't doing serious work on it. But I think so. I changed my mind that that for me should be off the table for now.
No game theory then?
Oh, game theory is okay. I'm not. I'm sympathetic to it as a formalism. My regret is that we didn't talk about something very nuts and boltish about education. I mean, we're all on the same page here about something. zooming out just a little bit, right? So local disagreements notwithstanding, we all believe something very foundational. That's why we're here, presumably. And we didn't talk about some very practical things, like what are the kind of things, how can we translate the concepts that we really care about to, not so much to the public, but into an educational context and make that take somehow. We didn't talk about sort of, other than the sort of communitarian or the mosques of mattering, which
Meaning, mosques of meaning.
That's a really good expression that we should probably edit. But we didn't talk about sort of practical issues like that, which I care about, and I think it would have been really helpful for us, just to Richard would, yeah. So that's something that I missed, and I think would be really valuable for subsequent discussions, like just the in education more generally. What role can our positions play in that context? So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk very, very briefly because, in fact, I have so much material to go over in my head to sort out that I'm afraid of saying too much. But that in itself, I think, is a measure of how, for me, how successful this conference was, about which I was extremely dubious. I think one thing that I really want to think about, and that I might have changed my mind on, is I think I'm feeling that the manifest image and the scientific image is closer than I used to by way of neuroscience. I actually feel that things that I thought there was just no way of bringing together, and yesterday's discussion about meaning was extremely useful to me in changing my mind about that I actually think there are some things we can say about generating meaning, intentionality, even mattering, perhaps. But I'm now seeing them as somewhat closer than I had before. But I have to think through that. This thing about free will, my mind was not at all changed. I've been thinking a lot about whether we should get rid of the word. For theoretical reasons, yes, I do think so. It would clean things up. However, it's very important never to forget that there's a whole history of discussion, and that what we're saying is a continuation of that discussion. And it would be very, very important, if we do decide to change the word, not to say we've dropped the ball, that we're answering certain questions that have been discussed here, or presenting what to me is a very coherent answer, and so that that there's a certain danger in changing the vocabulary there, because the continuity of the question. What else? I was a little disappointed in the discussion of consciousness, just because I would have liked to hear more of a connection between our discussion of the first day, in which we spoke about reduction and explanation and entailment and what's required for one level to be reduced to another. I wanted that brought home to consciousness, and what people here had to say about that, whether we're there, whether we're not, how far, I really would have, and if there was a difference of opinion about that, I would have liked to have heard that. Another subject I wish we had actually had on the board was the self, the nature of the self. And Terry, you mentioned, I think at the end of the last discussion, that none of this makes sense without the notion of, sort of an organism acting, undergoing this. And that was sort of parenthetically inserted there, and I think that's an extremely important point, and would have liked to have heard that discussed. The other thing was Yeah, I was very interested in the discussion about are conscious reasons better than unconscious reasons? And Dan, your remarks about, thinking's a kind of conversation, and there are different speakers that we have going on there, and once you make it conscious, you're making it available to different parts. I think that's, for me, a very, very useful idea. And it also reminded me of the use of this kind of thing. This is, because, once we're putting these things out there for not just other parts of our minds to hear, but other people who are thinking about this, people from different disciplines, enormously, enormously useful. And so I would just, I wish that this conversation could continue. I wish that we could not only push naturalism forward, but this particular group. I would want to just keep talking to this particular group about these issues.
Yeah, first I wanted to thank Sean again for organizing this, and also Nick for being the angel, giving us an opportunity to meet some of my intellectual heroes and a lot of people that I hope to keep contact with. I think, for me, the most valuable part of this conference, I think, is to have made contact with a lot of people that I can have discourse with in the future, particularly as I try to write this book on naturalism and theology. And I will call on you at some point. I guess the highlights for me of the meeting were, of course, the discussion of free will. That's something that I've thought and read a lot about, and I guess I'm gratified that people seem to agree that it is a black hole with Owen, that's a black hole of philosophy. I continue to disagree with Dan that if we tell people they don't have free will, that society will fall apart. That argument's been made for retaining religion and things like that, but it hasn't happened in countries like Scandinavia, so I need to be convinced by more than just performance on whether you cheat and whether you have free will. The discussion of entailment I thought was enlightening to me. Stephen's presentation of that, how higher levels can derive from lower levels. I remain unconvinced that there's any qualitatively new phenomena that are not entailed by the laws of physics, but I haven't seen anything. I think a priori that just seems impossible. I appreciated Massimo's discussion, particularly at the end, on scientism and ways of knowing. It was of remarkable clarity, I thought, and I would have liked to discuss it longer. One of the questions I have, which is unanswered in this meeting, is, are there other ways of knowing besides through science? Is mathematics a form of science? Are all questions about the universe only resolvable through empirical observation? And I'm open on that question. I hope to discuss it maybe some more with Dan on our drive back to Boston. The questions that are unresolved to me, first of all, about what naturalism is. I'm not sure still at this point what it is. We've had diverse definitions. I don't think we can move it forward until we know what it is, or at least we have a definition that we all agree on. But I think Owen made the point that he doesn't think that we've moved naturalism forward much here. And I think he's right, but I don't think that this is the kind of venue to move naturalism forward. The venue to move naturalism forward is in the political realm, because you dispel superstition through improving the lots of people in the world so that they don't have to turn to superstition. So the best thing I can say to do to move naturalism forward is to vote for Obama. Things I wish we had discussed more are the concept of morality and moral responsibility. Do they have any meaning? Is there a real meaning to being responsible versus morally responsible? And I hear diverse opinions about that. I'm not sure how I feel about. Well, actually, I don't think that people are morally responsible. I think they're responsible in a technical sense, but that's all. The other ways of knowing question I've mentioned, that's something I'm extremely interested in, and I'll probably be corresponding with some of you about. This is, of course, used to enable theism. Religious people say faith is another way of knowing. And we have all these other ways of knowing. They're efficacious, like in art, literature, and music, so why not through revelation as well? And I have to answer this question in my book, and I'm not sure yet how to do it. I wish we had talked more about the nature of reality. What do we mean by reality? Stephen said everything is real, including God, but only in the sense that Santa Claus is real. And I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what he meant, but except an idea has a reality, which to me is different from what I conceived of as a reality before. What I changed my mind about, and to me this is a substantial change, is based on what Sean and Dan and other people said. I wrote on my website this morning that I did not think that the formal discipline of the philosophy of science had any contribution to make to moving science forward. Discussing this morning, I realize now that that's not true. And I'm going to correct myself about that, and I will correct myself on that. I hope with Dan, based on discussion of free will, would also correct himself by saying that now he agrees that free will is equivalent to morally competent volition. So I'll make a deal with him that I'll renege if he'll admit that somewhere in print.
I've already said it in talks.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So, but people might want to edit it out because it's politically inexpedient. Oh, okay.
Where I talk about free will as moral competence.
Yeah, I think you and I would still disagree on what we mean by that. But anyway, that's the last point I wanted to make. And I thank everybody for talking to me, and Sean and Nick for helping arrange the whole thing.
Okay, I'm timing myself. So somebody mentioned, maybe a couple of people mentioned that we think better in groups, and this is, for me, a perfect example of that, as Rebecca said, sometimes philosophy is just so intensely uncomfortable that it's easy to opt to choose another path, moving forward in terms of the way I think about the world. But doing it in this group setting has been incredibly valuable for me, where I really did feel stuff shift. And I think at the beginning I said I would just love to have one philosophical argument that falsified some intuition that I had, and I can't say that I had that experience exactly. I think that some of my intuitions about free will or some of the other things like consciousness that we discussed are intact, but I also were exposed as being outmoded and maybe part of the tradition or the mythology that we need to move beyond. And so I'm very happy to say that I think my ideas now have expanded, and that's great. And it's been such a privilege to sit around a table with you, especially the dinner table and the lunch table, where I feel like a lot of the cultural divides get broken down, and then we come back into the room a little better after each one of those encounters. And I think this is part of the idea that what we're doing isn't just intellectual and written on the page, it also has a community component, a social component. I think we're feeling that even in this room, that as we start to exchange and feel part of the same community, we progress better. Our scholarship is improved, we get into the text better. And so I feel that this was an excellent start, and I hope it is a start. I'm looking at Sean and Nick. And that this conversation will be continued, because now I think both conceptually and culturally, we're in a better place to take on hardcore things that so this wasn't hardcore, but a new set of hardcore things like entropy and causality, which has come up a couple of times in the conversation, and I would love to have a better set of tools to use in thinking about that when I'm approaching theoretical physics and I'm thinking about time as I have to, and I'm thinking about the forward light cone or the past light cone, which I also should think of as the causal future and the causal past, right? And I need to do better in terms of understanding those concepts, and I would love to be able to push on them with a group like this, and with your help, and with, as has come up, exposing to my own mind my own ideas right through a different set of receptors. And other than that, I was sort of vaguely reminded of, and maybe this is complete nostalgia that's inappropriate, of a kind of Vienna Circle style thing happening here, where you were talking about metaphysics, and at the circle they sort of said, let's just toss away metaphysics entirely. All of these philosophical quandaries are simply an artifact of phrasing them badly. We all know that we believe in math and physics. Let's just phrase them properly. And I think even dictionaries of meaning versus semantics came up. We just have to have the right meaningless discussions and make a dictionary later and add meaning onto them, and all of this stuff will be cracked, and there's power in that. It's kind of, the idea that in all of mathematics, we will prove every mathematical fact. Now, of course, some of that program failed, but the way it failed was in the most interesting way it could possibly fail, which is that there's true facts among numbers that simply can't be proven in the context of arithmetic. This is a fantastic result. And I feel that, our conversation is sort of at that point. We're like, okay, we're naturalists. Let's phrase these questions better, properly. Nobody's going to accuse anyone of dualism or believing in fairies or any of these metaphysical things. And instead, we're going to progress. But then, is there going to be something deeply interesting down the road, like physical truths that are real, that are physical truths, that simply can't be gotten to in the way we would like to imagine we can get to them? And which is to say, I start with this set of axioms as you do with arithmetic, but in this case, maybe laws of physics, and I plow ahead. It's some things that struck me that I hadn't appreciated before, but again, probably intuitively felt could be a startling change and shift in how we think about it. So I thank all of you for challenging, me to dig a little deeper. And how to do in time? Because, oh man, 6 seconds. And I want to now, in the last half hour, allow for some crosstalk, because I thought that was very leveling in terms of giving us an opportunity to calibrate, find out where we all are, and I'm sure people have things to say to each other.
I think I'm actually going to suggest that we bring the formal discussions to a close right here at this high note, and have that crosstalk conversation, but just do it completely more informally, where we can all let our hair down and
leave the room. Okay, I just want to point out, I'm chair.
I know.
But I just had this really great idea. I think we should close the formal discussion. And where should we go down to, go down to the lion's den?
But for purposes of the video, let's just thank ourselves for doing such a great job.
Thank you.